Hello, friends. Welcome to the Cold War Prepper. I need to get my mic. You need to put my mic on. Golly. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Cold War Prepper. My name is Lee. And a little while ago, we did a kind of a survey amongst our subscribers, and there were two things that they were interested in studying in more detail. One was English grammar. We don't teach that anymore at school. And the other one's civics, and we don't teach that very much at school either. I think there's an absolute need. Hello, Diana 2. Hello, Stray Kitten. Hello, Little Lone Prepper. But I believe there's an absolute need for us to understand our form of government and our Constitution a little bit better than what we do, because that's causing a lot of disagreement among people here in the U.S. because they simply don't understand. Some things have happened that convince me that people really don't understand our form of government, the levels of government, and who's responsible for what and what the authorities are within each one of the offices within our form of government. So I figured we kind of break into this tonight. We'd start off with a live so that I can get kind of where your interests are and see what kind of buttons it touches for you. So we can move into that direction, and then we'll do the subsequent ones as basically maybe 20-minute recorded lessons, unless you want to continue doing it live. I'm here for you, so you tell me what you want to do, and I'll be happy to kind of work it that direction. So our source documents tonight, of course, my favorite of all of them. As a matter of fact, I have a bag full of these, and I will go around town passing them out. That's how much I believe in it. Not a whole bunch of tabs, but I do have a whole bunch of highlights. The second one we're going to be using is the Federalist Papers. So this is basically what from high school. And gosh, I graduated in 1970, if you can believe that. Helen's coming up on her 50th anniversary, 50th high school reunion is going to be this coming fall. So we're old folks. But anyhow, the Federalist Papers. And one of the things I really, really like about the Federalist Papers is back here, when you get to the Constitution, what it has is it has the notes basically on which one of the Federalist Papers supports that portion of the Constitution, as was written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. So you can always read the Constitution and see their comments about what they intended for it to mean, and that's a very important part. What is it they really wanted to bring out in the Constitution? What was it they really, really wanted to protect? I'm also going to use the Cliff Notes, okay, to the U.S. Constitution. And then I have an 8th grade Understanding the U.S. Constitution that I'll be using, and a high school American Government that we'll be using. So that's kind of what we'll have. And I figured tonight what we kind of do is set the stage. Hello, Holly. And hello, Sean. And KP Heathen, welcome. So if we, well, I am feeling a little bit better. Holly, I've had some real hard times breathing. I did all of my inhalers and everything else, and I did it in inhalation therapy, and with my machine here in the living room. Still having a hard time breathing, so I went to bed and put on my oxygen and kind of focused on that. I still am only at 92% blood oxygen after 2 hours on oxygen. So, we'll see where it goes. I'm going to check it right now and see what it says. I'm pretty good, 97, 95. So we're getting up there as far as oxygen in the blood. So, I think I'll make it through the night. But one of the problems I'm having right now is a lot of congestion. Of course, in the cannula for the oxygen goes in through the nose. So that kind of inhibits a little bit of the oxygen intake as well. So let me tell you what's convinced me that we need a little bit more about understanding about civics and about the Constitution. A couple things. The first one was about a year and a half ago. We got notice that the area just west of us, so if you looked past this window about maybe 3/4 of a mile, half a mile, that subdivision was going to be a Section 8 subdivision, and that is, it's going to be built primarily for the economically disadvantaged. So, it's not going to be a middle income area. It's going to be a low income area. We're going to have, different set of housing and everything else. And so the vice president of our HOA got on to our Facebook group and was really ranting. And she said that because somebody had passed out a door hanger and put it on everybody's front doors, and it said, we are, our housing values are going to decline because they're putting in 8A housing to the west of us. And so the VP of our HOA decided she'd get on our Facebook group, and she started ranting and raving that this was a Republican ploy to make Joe Biden look bad. And so I had to ask her, I said, where were you during high school civics if you took it at all? Because obviously you don't understand that local zoning has nothing to do with federal government. And federal government normally has nothing to do with local zoning. So how the local zoning does nothing to make President Biden look good or bad. It's all on our local authorities. It's all on our local city council. So remember that we have, hi, David Lynn. And, you've changed your name. Wow. So it used to be David Lynn Prepper Principal, and now it's David Lynn Taco Talk. Congratulations. And I also saw that you just went over 1,100 subscribers. So hopefully we can get that even up a little bit more tonight. But anyhow, so we have to understand that our government is in different layers, and different rules apply to different layers. So you've got the federal government up at the very top, then you have the state government, then you're going to have county governments, then you're going to have municipal governments. Even within the municipal government, you can have areas. Oh, congratulations, 1,200. So even within a municipal area, you can have subdivisions that have different levels of governmental control. You can have, here in Texas, we have what's called municipal utility districts, and those are typically going to be water and wastewater districts. So that's one voting entity. You can have a homeowners association or an HOA. They have different rules. They can control you in different ways as well, even to repossessing your house. Then you've got electric co-ops, and that's another form of government because it's cooperative. So there's all kinds of different levels of government within the U.S. And to say that any one is complicit or explicit within the framework of an action is usually not accurate or precise. Especially now, one exception can be the EPA. EPA with riparian rights and other things like that. They can be very controlling, and even down to the municipal area. Now, in Texas's state, here, I used to work for what was called the Texas Air Control Board, which was air pollution control. Then we had a governor who wanted to take over, so she asked our board of directors, and they had staggered appointments so that no governor could ever control through their own personal thing the board. So she asked all 6 of our board directors to resign so that she could appoint them and have absolute control over air pollution control in Texas. And they said, no, we aren't going to do that. So we had Senate Bill 2 that passed in 1991, 1992. And basically what it did was it took 13 different environmental agencies in the state of Texas, did away with those entities, merged them all into one entity that at that time we called the Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission. Those of us inside called it Trainwreck. Then she appointed all the people who were in charge of that, and it became an extremely political organization to the point where I had to leave. It got such a bad name of being such a bad political organization that they eventually had to change the name from TNRCC, the Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission, to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ. So that's kind of, the history of that. So let's take a look at things. Let me give you a couple trivia notes because these will become important as we get further into it. And so I'm going to get your guess on this. When Paul Revere did his ride in, I believe it was April of 1775, what did he most likely say as he rode through the Massachusetts area from Boston going towards Lexington and Concord? So what did Paul Revere most likely actually say? Let's see what you say here in comments. And then I'll give you a secret to that. So, no guesses as of yet. Well, here's a clue. Craig Davis, the British are coming. One of the most popular and common comments that were made. Same thing with Diana too. The British are coming. So let me ask you a question. What was Paul Revere? What nationality was he? What governmental entity had control over Paul Revere? Paul Revere was British. The colonies were British. So why would they say the British are coming if the British were already there and they were British? Most likely what he really said, and this is how sometimes, common folklore can kind of ruin what things actually are or what they actually say. What he probably most likely said was one of two things. Either the regulars are coming, meaning the regular army, or the redcoats are coming, which is another vernacular for the regular army. He probably would not have said the British are coming because that could have meant that it would have been the militia as well. Let's take a look at Article 2. Let me see here. Rosary Family Hour, God, Family, and Guns, and Divine Will Era premiere. Okay, we're going to have to get rid of you guys. Let me go here and see if I still have it up. Okay, I do, so I can share this. Okay, so let's start first with the Second Amendment. Does anybody know what so this is the part that basically is always used for gun control. And it says, the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the question becomes one of, what is a militia? So we're going to go here to Title 10, U.S. Code, paragraph 246. And we're going to see that what it says is, right here, the militia of the United States consists of all able-bodied males at least 17 years of age, and except as provided in Section 313 of Title 32, under 45 years of age, who are or have made a declaration of intention to become citizens of the United States, and of female citizens of the United States who are members of the National Guard. The classes of the militia are: 1, the organized militia, which consists of the National Guard and the Naval Militia, and 2, the unorganized militia, which consists of the members of the militia who are not members of the National Guard or the Naval Militia. So guess what? What that means is basically that anybody who is between the ages of 17 and 45 in the U.S. is a member of the militia. So that introductory clause guarantees them the right to have a firearm. Bet you didn't know that, did you? Okay, let's go to another one, the 5 basic forms of government. So we can look at the 5 forms of government, and I'm going to use left and right, and this is just because I'm going to define it this way. Please don't interpret me as saying that left, what we consider left in the U.S. right now, or right, what we consider right in the U.S. right now, as being gooder or worser. How's that for English grammar? Better or worse than the other. I'm just using them for illustrative purposes only. So at one end, okay, we have total control by an individual. Okay, we can call that monarchy for lack of a better term, but we can also refer to it as a tyrannical leader. So we have, some historical leaders who are basically totalitarian. Joseph Stalin comes to mind, Genghis Khan. We have Mussolini, we have Hitler. Any person, we have, what's his name down in Castro, Fidel Castro. And we have a couple like that. There were individuals who basically had total control over a country. Now, as we move in at the other end, okay, so we have total control by an individual. And at the other end, we have anarchy. Dictator's a fantastic way to put it. Thank you, Diana, too. So at the other end of the spectrum, we have no government or anarchy. So anarchy means without rule of law in Latin. So we have total control by an individual at one end and no control at the other, no rule of law. So somewhere we've got some medians in between. So let's move from a totalitarian or a dictator or a monarchy, and let's move to the next one, which is a group of people having control over another group of people, and we're going to call that an oligarchy. So basically, that's the elites, okay? So you have these elite people. So if we take a look at the Tsar in Russia, the Tsar in Russia did not have total control over the people. He had what they called the boyars, or the Duma. Duma in Russian means to think. So these were the thinkers, basically his Senate. So the emperor couldn't do anything without the Duma's approval, basically. But they were all elite oligarchs, and so they would basically sign off on anything the Tsar wanted to do. So they just kind of gave him carte blanche to do what he wanted to do. If we look back historically, we've also got the Roman Empire. Up until the time of the Caesar, which is where Tsar comes from, for those of you who are looking into etymology of vocabulary. So it's Caesar, Tsar, same word in Russian and in Latin. And so you had this oligarchy before the emperors, where you had basically Caesar, Julius Caesar, and the Senate until he dissolved the Senate. So the Senate was all those rich people, the oligarchs, basically, who supported whatever Caesar had to say or wanted to do. Then he did away with it, so they became basically a perfunctory organization. And from Augustus Caesar on, all they were basically a signatory. They had no real power. There was no way they could oppose Caesar. They basically were a support group for Caesar. Now, in the center, okay, so you've got no control, you've got total control. In the center, you have something called demokratia, which is a Greek word, and we translate it as democracy. So it basically means mob rule. And what do I mean by mob rule with democracy? Well, as long as more than half of the people agree to something, then it becomes law. Okay, so there are two wolves and one sheep, and they're going to have a democratic discussion about what is for dinner. And so if the two wolves say we're going to eat the sheep, there's 2 votes versus 1, the sheep is forfeited. So in a democracy, you have mob rule, you have the majority wins. There are no constraints to what a democratic government can do. Now, as we move more towards a little bit more sanity and control, we have what's called in Greek respublika, or a republic. And this was Plato's invention. And Plato says that basically a republic is a democracy that is tethered by the rule of law. So now we have so we put into place a law, and it says You can vote on what you're having for dinner, but it cannot be one of the members of the voting group. So now you take those same two wolves and a sheep, and the two wolves say, hey, we're going to eat the sheep. Okay, we got 2 votes to 1, but the sheep says, no, we've got a law. And the law says you can't eat one of the members of the voting group, so you can't eat me. You've got to vote for something else. So that's the difference between a democracy and a republic. Democracy, mob rule. Republic, you have voting, but you also have the rule of law, an underlying rule of law. So let's take a look at historically what was going on that caused this revolution and this institution of a constitution. So David Lynn, and this is my favorite high school principal here, said that the regulars were on the march. That's probably very accurate, either the regulars or the redcoats. And so let's take a look at some of the history here. So we have basically primarily British, some Dutch, some Irish, settling along the eastern shore of the U.S., primarily for religious freedom. So what has happened in England that's causing them to leave for religious freedom? A couple things. King Henry VIII wanted to have another wife, and so he had already had, I think, 5 wives at the time. And the church, the Catholic Church, would not give him permission to divorce again and remarry. And so there was this thing going on at the time called the Protestant Revolution. We had a guy in 1517 in Wittenberg, Germany, who wrote a thesis, 97-point thesis, and stapled it to the church. And that began the Protestant Revolution. And so now you had these people who were separating themselves from the Catholic Church. Until 1517, if you were Christian, you were Christian of the Catholic Church. Now that could be either of 2 rites. That could either be the Roman Catholic rite in the West or the Greek Orthodox rite in the East. But all Christians were Catholics until 1517. And so Martin Luther broke away from that. So guess what? Old King Henry VIII, he has this thing. He says, wait a minute, if people are breaking away from the church won't let me get divorced, and I want a divorce, then I can form my own church. And he did. He formed a church called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And later King James would come along and say, you know what? The Bible is in Latin, and we don't want it in Latin. We would like to have it translated into English so that we can give it to our people, so that they can understand it. He says, so I'm going to have a whole bunch of people study the Bible and translate it. But there's one exception. You can't translate anything that in any way neglects the authority of me as the king. So you have to translate it in such a way that I retain God principled kingship over England. And so we have the King James version of the Bible. And that's how that came about. So now you've got some remnants of people who remain faithful to the Catholic Church. You've got some breakaways from the breakaways from the breakaways. So you had the Quakers, you had the Amish, you had all kinds of different subgroups of the Protestant Revolution who felt that they were being subjected to terrible rules in England concerning the church. So here's where we come up with the idea of separation of church and state that would later become endemic in our Constitution. And that is that if you are a British citizen, you automatically tithe through your income tax to the Church of England, whether you're a Jew, a Catholic, a Protestant, a Lutheran, or anything else. It doesn't matter, a Muslim. You're going to tithe to the Church of England. You're going to give to it because that's the way it is. So we didn't want, when we broke free from Great Britain, we did not want to have a church of the United States where our citizens were going to be forced to give money to it or anything else. We wanted total separation between the church and the state so that each was separate and the church was not controlled by the state. Notice, we wanted it so that the church was not controlled by the state, not necessarily the other way around. Now, we didn't want a theocracy, which is a religious, like right now we have in Iran, where it's a theocracy basically based on Islam. So the rule of the religion is greater than the rule of the state, if that makes sense. So that's where we come up with the whole idea of basically the separation of church and state. Let's go back to where we were. We're kind of building this now. So we want religious freedom. That's the reason that they came here. They didn't want to have to tie to the Church of England. They wanted a whole new opportunity in life. They wanted to be able to get land. Becoming a landowner was basically the penultimate thing in British society. Landowners were basically lords, okay? And so if they could come here to the colonies and get land, then they basically become a lord. So people were coming to the colonies under the Hudson Bay Authority, all these different, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Authority, all these different British groups that were coming to the United States. Well, we had a little tete-a-tete with the French. The British and the French historically just don't get along whatsoever. I'm surprised that they rejoined NATO. Most of you probably don't know, but under Charles de Gaulle, France left NATO back in the late 60s, and it took them, I think, until 2005. They were separate from NATO. They were independent from NATO from 1965-ish until around 2005-ish. So they were not in NATO. They just recently rejoined NATO. But anyhow, the French and the British just do not get along. So we had another group of people who were coming in and trying to take over or colonize, I guess is the proper word, America, and that was the French. And they had two different major colonies. They had one up north in Quebec. They had another one down south in Louisiana. So that area in Quebec, there was a lot of contention over areas in New York, Pennsylvania, around the Great Lakes and things like that. So we fought what is called the 7 Years' War. I want you to pay attention. This is the 7 Years' War, but it took place from 1755 to 1764. 64 minus 55 is not 7, it's 9, but they call it the 7 Years' War. And part of that 7 Years' War, and this is where you get some basic American military knowledge from George Washington, who was a colonel in the militia and fought and we call it the French-American War. I'm sorry, the French-Indian Wars. We have Aaron Burr. We have, what was his name that they gave up West Point? Famous traitor to the U.S. He became a general in the British Army for having betrayed West Point. God, this is going to slip my mind. I know David Lynn's going to come up with it here in just a minute. But anyhow, so a lot of these guys in our militia had basically served fighting the French and the Indians up until 1764. Well, that took a lot of money out of the British coffers. And so the British needed to replenish their treasury. So how did they do that? They said, well, most of this fighting took place in North America. So what we're going to do is we're going to put taxes on the North Americans to refill our coffers from the expenses we paid fighting the French in North America. So they came out with the Tea Act, the Stamp Act, and a couple other acts where they were basically taxing the Americans. Well, now we had, one weapon, basically the musket. Benedict Arnold, I knew somebody would come up with it. Thank you so much. There we go. So that was the traitor that gave up West Point during the Revolution to the British, and then became a British general because of it. But anyhow, so most of these guys had served fighting the French or fighting the Indians. Now, why would we say Indians? Because the French were very good at building relationships with the Indians, and so they had a lot of Indian allies. and those Indian allies fought against the U.S. So if you read the book, The Last of the Mohicans, that's basically what's going on. That's during the French and Indian Wars. And that's the story behind basically the Mohicans were pro-British, and the Algonquins and a couple other tribes were primarily pro-French, and that's where you got the Indian versus Indian fighting as well. Okay, so now we're up to 1764. The war has ended. The French have lost. The British want to recover all of that money that they spent. So they started taxing the living daylights out of the Americans. So that's where we come up with basically the Boston Tea Party, where we come up with what's that one called, where we had the Boston Massacre out in front of the Parliament, or the General Haig's, not General Haig. There was a riot, and some Americans were shot at the Boston Massacre. John Adams, by the way, was the defense attorney for that, defending the British, and won. But anyhow, so we've got all this animosity from the colonists rising up against the British government, the Crown. So now they started thinking, wait a minute, these guys are getting a little bit kind of rambunctious. So what we need to do is, we don't want to take away their muskets, because they use their muskets not only for military service, they use it to hunt, and they use it to defend themselves against any remnant French or any remnant anti-British Indians. So we're going to allow them to keep their muskets, but we want all of our cannons back. Well, there happened to be an armory in Concord, in Massachusetts, and that armory had a lot of gunpowder, a lot of shot, and a cannon. So the British regular army, General Howe, that's who it is, General Howe. So General Howe decided he's going to send a battalion of regular infantry from the British garrison in Boston. They're going to march towards Concord. They're going to steal, or they're going to confiscate the cannon and bring it back. Okay. So this is where Paul Revere comes in. So what they didn't know was, were they going to go up the James River and then do basically a naval, let's call it a marine landing, and then go into Concord, or were they going to do it just by following the roads? And so that's where Paul Revere's ride going towards Lexington and Concord comes in, that he was warning them that they're coming by land. They were marching. So basically, by the time they got to Lexington, the Minutemen were there, and that's where the shot heard around the world started. And then, of course, the colonists, using their guerrilla tactics, inflicted grave harm on the British as they were marching to and from Concord. They never did get the cannon, and so that became the basis of the beginning of the Revolutionary War. That was in, I believe, April of 1775. Okay, so we were basically at war with Great Britain, having the Revolution, for almost a year, or just a little bit over a year, before we wrote the Declaration of Independence, which we celebrate tomorrow, July 4th. Thank you, Craig's April 17th. So basically, we were at war with the British for 1 year before we came out with the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Now, from the time we wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, it took from 1776 until we approved the Constitution in 1787 for us to form a government. So now we had one attempt in between 1787 and 1776. That was the Articles of Confederation, and that was adopted in 1781. But we found out that there were all kinds of problems with the Articles of Confederation. So the Constitution basically replaced the Articles of Confederation when it was adopted in 1780. Gosh, now I'm going to confuse myself. I can't remember if it's 1785 or 1787. Somebody will look that up. I know for sure, and keep me straight. Huh? And Helen is saying she thought it was 1786. So we'll see. Somebody will look that up, and we'll have the actual data on here very shortly. So that's kind of where we are. Number one, religious freedom. Number two, they wanted to keep all their weapons so that they could, number one, fight off a tyrannical government. Number two, defend themselves from the Indians. Number three, hunt and provide food. So all those things that you hear politically about you don't need this type of a weapon to hunt, that was only part of it. The number one reason we wanted to keep the weapons was to fight a tyrannical government so that we would never again be. But anyhow, I'm sorry. So the whole reason behind the Constitution is to provide a protection against a tyrannical government. That's why it's divided into the sections that it is, and it has specific parameters. You cannot do certain things. So it's an empowering document, but it's also a limiting document. Okay. So it empowers a government to do certain things, but it limits. You can only do the things that are authorized in the Constitution. So, what are the major sections of the Constitution? Section 1 is the legislative branch. Section 2 is the executive branch or the president. Section 3 is the judicial branch. Section 4 is the states. Section 5 is how you can amend the Constitution. Section 6 is salaries, privileges, constraints of the members of Congress. And then Section 7 is how a bill becomes law. I'm sorry, that's wrong. That's Article 1. Okay, so let's go. Section 4 is states. Yep. So one is legislation. 2 is executive, 3 is judicial, 4 is the states, 5 is the amendment process, 6 is the legal status of the Constitution, 7 is how to ratify the Constitution. So all the states had to ratify it. And then we have, after that, the first 10 amendments called the Bill of Rights. So here are a couple of weird things that are in the Constitution. Okay. So Article 1, Section 8, other than the 16th Amendment. Now, the 16th Amendment was an additional thing that we gave Congress the authority to do one other thing. The 16th Amendment, we say you have the authority to collect income tax. Okay. Other than that, the only things that Congress is allowed to do is listed or detailed in Article 1, Section 8. So I strongly recommend you read that because there's a lot of things that Congress has done they don't have the authority to do. Kay, you would not believe how hot it is here. It's 104 here today. So we've got, where was I? Gosh, I forget where I was. Oh, okay. So Article 1, Section 8 says what they can do, and they can't do anything beyond that. Article 2, Section 2 is what the president is allowed to do. Okay. So let's take a look at a couple things here. Number one, let's take a look at Article 2, Section 2. If I can get my little Constitution open here. Article 2, Section 2. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and the militia of the several states. When called into the actual service of the United States, he may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. And he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Okay? So I'm going to break away from reading the Constitution here for a minute. Remember, there was a group of people, a particular political party, back in 2020, who said that if you reelected President Trump, he was going to pardon himself of his impeachments. Do you remember that? Well, obviously, they have never read Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, the end of the first paragraph, which says, And he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. He shall have power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So now we're going to go into another one of Lee's expletives, okay? And that is the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and the President of the United States do not have the authority to enter into any international agreement, whether it be the World Economic Forum, whether it be the World Monetary System, the World Health Organization, the World Global Environmental Agency, or anything like that, unless it is ratified by the Senate with a 2/3 vote. Provided 2/3 of the senators present concur, and he shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper, in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. The President shall have power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of the next session. Section 3. He shall from time to time give to Congress the information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. He may, on extraordinary occasions, convene with houses or either of them, and in case of disagreement between them, in respect to the time of adjournment, he may adjourn them to such time as he shall think proper. He shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and shall commission all the officers of the United States. There's another key clue there, another key phrase. Hello, Butch, welcome. And that is, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, remember that we have a law on the books that was passed by Congress and signed by President Trump, and well, actually, that's signed by President Bush on immigration control. Then we have another law that was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Trump that we would build a wall. Both of those laws are not being faithfully executed by the current president. Okay, one more trivia question for you. What form of government appears in this document? Only one form of government is ever mentioned in this document. It's only mentioned one time. Does anybody know what form of government is mentioned in this document? And I will give you a hint. It is in Article 5. No, it's Article 4. The states. Article 4, Section 4, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. Now, remember the difference between Republic and Democrat in the sense of talking about forms of government. Democracy means every individual has a vote, majority wins. Republic says, yes, we use the voting system for everybody to have a vote, but that's constrained by the rule of law. So you can have a vote as long as you don't deprive these things. There's a fantastic video. I'll put a link down to it below. It's only 5 minutes long, and it basically goes through those 5 forms of government. The example they use there is a posse out in the Wild West. So somebody's accused of horse wrestling. The posse comes upon them. They throw a noose over a tree. They take an election and they say, okay, is he guilty or not guilty? 51% say he's guilty. He's hung. Okay, that's a democracy. In a republic, they say, okay, we're going to lynch him. 51% say he's guilty. The sheriff comes along and says, wait, we've got the 5th and 6th Amendments to the Constitution. And they guarantee, number one, he has to have a trial. Number two, he has to face his accusers. You have to prove, that his guilt and all this kinds of stuff. And so you can't hang him. We have a process by which we do this, okay, the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. And then not only is it majority rule, it has to be what? Unanimous rule. So, but here's another little clue. Those are interpretations. They aren't necessarily written or codified in the Constitution itself. Two of the basic things that we have in our government. Number one, innocent until proven guilty appears nowhere in the Constitution. It's an inferred right that we have historically always adopted, and by precedent, that is how we operate. That you are innocent until proven guilty. Number two, that it has to be unanimous conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. That's another tort or a writ, a written law that is not necessarily in the Constitution. So you won't find the rule of a jury trial or anything like that in the Constitution because that was left to the states. Okay. So let's get to something interesting going on here. Let me see what it is. The state of Texas is constructing border wall using materials purchased during the Trump administration, and Texas is buying the materials. And yeah, that's absolutely correct. Did you see the video today that was released of a federal border patrol agent cutting the concertina wire and letting illegal aliens into our country? I thought that was kind of interesting that the feds are basically destroying what the state is doing, denying people access to the state. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so let's take a couple recent court decisions. Okay, let's take number one, and of course I have a religious viewpoint on it, but let's take the first one is the Dobbs decision. So I'm going to give you an allegory here. So basically, if I'm driving down the road here in Texas and the speed limit is 80, and I see a sign and it says, State of Oklahoma, speed limit 75, and I get a ticket for going 5 miles per hour over the speed limit because I broke an Oklahoma state speed law in Texas, will that stand? No, because Oklahoma has no authority to declare a speed limit on the roads in Texas. So that's basically what the Dobbs decision says. Remember, Congress can only do those things that are mentioned in Article 1, Section 8 and the 16th Amendment. Okay? So nowhere in Article 1, Section 8 does it say that they have the right to rule on abortions. Okay? If they don't have the right to rule on abortions, then guess what? Whether or not an abortion can be allowed is not something the Supreme Court can adjudicate because they didn't have the authority to say yes or no in the first place. So what does the Constitution say? Well, what the Constitution says in Amendment 10, the powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, and that's basically referring back to Article 1, Section 8, as well as the 16th Amendment, and prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So that's what the Dobbs decision said. It said, wait a minute, the federal government never had the authority to make this decision in the first place. So it was an invalid decision. Therefore, we are remanding the decision-making authority according to the 10th Amendment. Now prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So what they did was they said federal government can't be involved. This is a state decision. This is something that has to be decided state by state. So people were up in arms, that the federal government, but in reality, the people were strict constitutionalists and they interpreted the Constitution as is written. And that's how the Dobbs decision came about. Let's take another one that's come up recently, the 14th Amendment case. And what it says is, If we go back to 1968, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And as a result of that, we said, you know what? We historically have had a bilateral, even though it's supposed to be separate but equal with segregation, we had a bilateral education system. One was a little bit better than the other. Okay. And so, because of that, this other group who did not receive the same level of education as this group can't pass the admission test to the same extent as this group. Therefore, we're going to give them a temporary helping hand and make sure that some of them get in, regardless of the education system that they come from. So we're going to have a quota, and you have to admit so many of these people, regardless of their academic proficiency, for a temporary time as a remediation for not having had a good education system. That was 2 generations ago. We've had 2 generations using the exact same education system. So you would think that by now, that temporary measure that was mentioned in 1968 under the Civil Rights Act of 1968 should go away, and that people should now be judged basically based upon their qualifications and not by the color of their skin. So remember the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment has one particular clause we really need to pay attention to. And so let's take a look at Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction, and here's the key words, the equal protection of the laws. So what happens anytime, even if it's a temporary and it's intended to correct a previous ill system, anytime you give preference to one group, you are violating the 14th Amendment because you're not giving equal protection to anybody. So for the past 14 years, we've been in violation of the 14th Amendment because we've given preferential treatment based on a protected class to one group at the exclusion of all these other groups, okay, whatever they are. And so what the Supreme Court decided was, 2 generations ago, that may have been appropriate as a temporary action. But now, basically, what we're saying is everybody should be following the 14th Amendment and everybody should be equal. Okay. So does that make sense? How they made that decision? Okay. So what we will do is basically I'm going to try to follow this book. And so we kind of did chapter 1 today, which was the history of the United States. You have to understand the context of where the laws came from. You have to understand the context of where we were as a country in order to understand why we wrote some of the laws the way that we did and why they're in the books the way that they did. Let's go over one more. I want to go over a January 1st, 1803 personal letter that was written from Thomas Jefferson to the First Baptist Church of Danbury, Connecticut. What we found was a lot of the states had kind of a majority of the population were of a particular denomination or sect. Okay. And at that time in Danbury, the Baptists were kind of out. They weren't included in everything. They were, one of those fringe religions. So the First Baptist Church of Danbury, Connecticut, wrote a letter to President Jefferson and said, hey, President Jefferson, you've got to come down and straighten out these other religious people because they are basically trampling, they've got their thumb on us because we're Baptists. And so the federal government has to do something to control these people and not allow them to persecute us because we are Baptists. So Thomas Jefferson wrote a famous letter on January 1st. It's a personal letter, not as President of the United States, but as a person. He wrote to them and he said, dear sirs, I can't do anything. there is an inseparable wall between religion and the government in the United States. So this is where we get the wall of separation between the government and religion. So basically, what Thomas Jefferson is saying is the federal government cannot interfere in religion. It doesn't say the other way around. Because remember, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, John Jay, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, they all said that the Constitution was only as good as the morality of the men enforcing it. And so they thought that it would be necessary to have a moral, religious government to totally fulfill the obligations of the Constitution. So the way that the interpretation of that is religion should have an influence on the Constitution, because that way you have a moral obligation, you have some sense of morality in which people have some dignity in the way that they govern, but the government cannot interfere in religion. Now, we have allowed the government to encroach on religious areas that were historically religious in the past. Even up until the 1950s, if you wrote a marriage agreement in a Bible, that was considered a valid marriage license. The first marriage license was granted in Kansas after the Civil War. And the reason it was granted was because there was a black man who wanted to marry a white woman. And they said, no, 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 no. You can't do that. You have to have a license from the state in order to get married. And you have to pay X number of dollars in order to get that license. So the original reason we had marriage licenses in the United States, the first one, was to restrain from interracial marriages. But then what we discovered was it's another source of revenue. If we can collect $25, $30 from somebody in order to say you're married, then we are going to take over what historically has been a religious sacrament, and we're going to dictate who can and who cannot be married. So the family Bible kind of went askew. It now became a state function and not a religious function. Even as late as the 1930s with Father Flanagan's Boys Town, most of the orphanages in the world were run by religious organizations. Then starting in the 30s, they decided that the government could do it better. So the government started taking over all the religious orphanages. And I would say that they probably are not that much better. If you take a look at healthcare, as far as health institutions, the vast majority of them originally were by religious organizations and charities, and the government took over that. And look where we are now. So what we see the government encroaching on religion and taking away all of the things that religion did, to include taking care of the poor and the homeless. So that was historically a religious thing, which is where the Salvation Army originated from, was that they were going to, I don't know if you know it or not, but all commissioned officers in the Salvation Army are ordained ministers. So it's basically a religious organization that's providing help and assistance to the people who are homeless, in need of shelter and things like that. But now we see that most of the homelessness and everything has been taken over, not by religious organizations and charities, but by the federal government. And how are they doing? So really, really interesting how our government has encroached on religion and then has kicked religion aside and said, you can't do that. So, to include, when I was younger, of course, my first 2 years of high school was at a Jesuit high school. So we prayed all the time. We went to mass at 11:30 every day before lunch. But when I got to public school, we still had a morning prayer in the morning. Then the last year, my senior year, 1969, 1970, that was replaced by a moment of silence, because they were afraid that saying a prayer was not going to include everybody in the group. So instead of a prayer, we had a moment of silence. As a matter of fact, I did that over the PA system. I was the person who did that moment of silence over the PA system every day for my senior year in high school. So just some ideas about what we have. If you all would like to continue this discussion, please do me a favor, put it in the show notes down below. Apologize for the off-camera tete-a-tete that we had. But, you know, as we say back home, Gavno является, which is in Spanish, mierde pasada, or in German, Scheiße stimmt, or in English, poo-poo occasionally gets into the middle of it. So remember, thank you all for being here. Let me see here if we got anything that I need to comment on. So the oath that was taken is, at least in the military, I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the officers appointed over me in accordance with the Uniform Code of Military Justice, so help me God. I first took that oath in 1971. I still know it to this day. So the right to a fair trial is basically the Sixth Amendment. So Little on Prepper, thank you very much. And Cats and Prepping says, yes, please continue. Craig Davis says, thank you. Hello Tofu says, thank you. Diana too says she'd love to continue this conversation. And yes, you are absolutely right, Craig. Every person, actually at every level of government, has to take an oath. So when I was a state employee, when I worked for the Texas Air Control Board, the air pollution control, I took an oath to uphold the Texas Constitution. So yes, almost every employee of a governmental entity takes an oath to support and defend that governmental entity at what level it is. So, okay, I hope you got something out of this. Thank you all for being here. Remember that we're all in this together so we can come out the other side together. Please be kind, polite, and respectful to each other. And remember that togetherness is the key. Take care. Bye-bye.